In this section we will go about texturing and rendering our flying logo object. So we have this logo here. It comes flying in. To export an animation that we can actually see, we need to go to our rendering options. First of all, see how it defaults to 1 to 60, even though our animation goes from 1 to 90. I could go ahead and hit the render scene button and it will ask me about that because it sees that something is funky. I'm just going to go ahead and type in 90 so it renders from my first frame to my last frame. I need to select my output files, so I'm going to click on RGB files and give myself a file called logo and type in a file name, which will also be logo, and choose the format. I generally use Targa 32 because I want 32-bit images, and I've always used Targas. Lately though, I've been liking PNGs because they seem to work very well, and a lot of people like using them. So I could go directly to save animation, but I'll run into trouble if I need to stop this halfway through, or if like one frame for some reason would go bad. It's a lot safer to render your frames first and then compile the animation later. So I have my scene here. I want to render this out, so I would go to Render Scene. Do I want to turn off Render Display? I generally say no, because I'm not the brightest person in the world, and I tend to make mistakes, and it's very handy to see a frame as it's being rendered. Now you see it's updating as it's rendering. This is a Lightwave 8 thing. In Lightwave 7.5 I found that it only renders the very first frame and sits there. This is a mixed blessing because although it's cool to see it all come out, it does seem to use up a lot of memory storing all those images. And say you had a 1,000 frame animation, that's 1,000 frames that it's saving up there. See that? They are all still in there. So because this is such a simple object and none of the options are turned on, this is rendering in half a second per frame. Long way since the old days. We couldn't even get a wireframe to render that fast. However, we don't have any shadows, we don't have any reflections, we don't have any transparencies, all those things that take a lot more rendering. Also, we are rendering a very low quality here. We don't have anything on that's called anti-aliasing. And we'll see in just a moment as this finishes in another 4 seconds. And we'll look at our last frame here. Now, this looks all stair-steppy. People have various names for it, bitmappy. I'm zooming in, this is at 300%, and we'll see it on the curves mostly. You can see all these chunks in here. That's called aliasing. So we want anti-aliasing. Even before we go in and we adjust our colors and things, let's deal with this. Now, anti-aliasing is a way of making it look nicer. And that is done under camera properties. All of our layout objects have their own set of properties. This is an important one. Properties. Our camera settings. This is something you will have to decide at the point when you know what your destination will be. 640 by 480 or D1 resolution, 720 by 486. If it's going to DV, is 720 by 480. You'll have to punch that one in. We're going to stick with the default VGA 640 by 480. This is the magic setting, anti-aliasing. It defaults to off. I'm going to set it to low. Now what will happen, and I'm going to render a single frame here by hitting F9. Hopefully your F buttons are hooked up. Now when I zoom into this, we will see that there's still some stair stepping in here. Actually, what I will do, go into my camera properties, turn it off, render a frame. Once again, zoom in at 300%. This is with no anti-aliasing. Go to my previous render. This is with anti-aliasing. Let's go even further, 400%. I'm using my arrow key, by the way, to zip around on this view. No anti-aliasing, big chunks there. Even the lowest level of anti-aliasing smooths that out considerably. If we look at the full view, much cleaner as opposed to this, where even with our crude screen capture we ought to be able to see a difference. That setting, under Cameras, Properties, Anti-Aliasing, Enhanced Low, does the same number of passes. In many cases it gives superior results. It's looking very nice and smooth there. And you can set your levels to anti-aliasing even higher. See where the pass up here says 9 passes? Took 4.2 seconds, which is not a long time. However, it's 8 times more than 0.5 seconds. So you can get a much smoother, much nicer looking edge. All it costs you is rendering time. Now, 4 or 5 seconds a frame is not much. However, like I said, it is 8 times more than doing it in a single pass. There is the option of adaptive sampling, which does things in a slightly different way. Go back to our standard. What it does, it goes in and it looks for the stair stepping and attempts to smudge it over. Sometimes it works. Some people like the look. This is definitely a per job decision. I suggest start with enhanced anti-aliasing or enhanced low and render a frame, take a look at it. If it looks good to you, if it looks good, it is good. As long as we're here in the camera properties, when things are moving, to take away some of the computeriness, turn on motion blur, normal. Any level is good. Now we have our logo whipping around the side. I'm going to render 2 frames with enhanced low, one with it off. And now I'm going to turn motion blur on, render it again. The difference is not real apparent. You can see it's sharper. It appears sharper without motion blur than it does with motion blur. However, when this is in motion and when this is laid to video, even that 50% motion blur, which means it's just kind of smushing the motion between these 2 frames, actually half the distance between those 2 frames, it is odd, but it actually looks clearer with motion blur turned on when it's moving, being played back on video than it does without motion blur. The way anti-aliasing and motion blur works is every time, let's go with the enhanced and extreme, we'll set a ridiculous amount of motion blur. We see this is 33 passes, and you can see how that's kind of creeping back with each pass. what motion blur does is calculates the motion between the frames. We are on frame 68. So this is the difference between frame 68 and 67 multiplied 5 times because I set it to 500%. The way anti-aliasing works is it renders each object 5 times and offsets it around the original pixel to give us the illusion of a much smoother image. We still have the same resolution. We still have that 640 by 480, but because of that anti-aliasing that takes place, it appears to be much smoother. So let's put this back to a more reasonable setting. So this is how we render. We go into our rendering options. We select the file format. We select the location. We select the frame range, 1 to 90. And there are occasions when, if it's taking a long time to render, if things are way in the background, maybe we only need low anti-aliasing, and then perhaps the logo itself, gets big in our face, and we need enhanced anti-aliasing. So we might render, 1 through 30 at low anti-aliasing, but 30 through 60 at medium or high, which is another reason to render frames instead of going straight to an animation file. So this is only half the battle. We have a logo flying in, but we still have it being, well, purple and green. And I'm looking at this and thinking, when that ends, I think I want it a little bit closer. So I'm just going to go in, object, logo selected. I'm going to bring it a little bit closer. I need some safe area here. Create key. And actually, I think maybe I want to tilt it. And create key, and there we are. Our logo flying in. I'm going to call this, I'm going to save this scene as Logo 3. Now, two things I want to do. I want to add some more lights because we have one default light. That is our light. I want to have a side light, maybe a backlight. So I'm just going to go into Add Lights. We have several different kinds of lights here. I'm just going to select another distant light. And we will get into how lights work in a different section. I'm just going to call this one side light. Move it to the side. Select rotation. And we can kind of see what's going on. My OpenGL still turned on. See, light's facing away. Light's facing towards it. Have it kind of like that. I'm going to create a key. I don't want that to be at 90 because I have my original setting at 0 and it'll move. So I'm just going to type in 0, hit return, and now that keyframe, even though I was on 90 because I punched in 0, created that key at 0. So go back to my camera view. It's lit up pretty good. I want to change my light settings, so I go to Properties. I have my main light, my side light, and just for fun, I'm going to change the color. I'm just clicking on my RGB values, red, green, blue, and sliding them up and down to change the values. I'm just going to make it a little bit warmer, kind of yellow and sunlight. And my side light, I was like giving a little blue tinge. And see how this one is 50% strength. My key light is 100%. I'll just bring that down. That seems a little hot. Maybe not that much. And that's good enough for now. Just put in 2 lights. You can see it's really being picked up by that default color because that's just like an eggshell white. I've got my warmer color here, a little more than I normally would. I usually wouldn't have it quite as tinted, but these are for purposes of demonstration. And blue here. I'm going to render a single frame here. Still have my green and purple and default. But it already has a little bit more depth. It's looking a little cleaner because I have anti-aliasing turned on. I have two different color lights. So now comes texturing. Now, texturing, I can spend days and days on texturing, and believe me, I have. But we're just going to do this quickly. So I have my logo object. The only reason this is green, purple, and eggshell white is because when I built it, I wanted to have distinctly different colors so I could easily identify the polygons. I'm going to change my surfaces. And to do that, I go to my Surface Editor. So I click on Surface Editor, brings up this menu. And I can see, clicking on the side here, I have sides, text bevel, text front. And to keep things consistent, this should be text sides. So I'm going to rename text sides. Now, this changes the object as it is in layout. These settings do not get changed unless I resave this object. And I'm going to do that. It's logo. I'm going to save current object. I could also save object copy, which is sometimes useful. But save current object. I'm going to call this logo 01. You can call it logo 01, logo A, logo textured, whatever. That's not important. It's whatever works for you, helps you remember. So we have text bevel, text front, and text sides. Switch to perspective so I can move things around a little bit more. Right now, these objects have very few attributes. Now that's an important name, attributes. Attributes means why something looks like it does, at least in the surface editor. We have all these settings, and then we have more settings, and then still more options. We're going to deal with the basics here. Color. Everybody ought to be able to understand color. We can see our OpenGL, even in real time, is changing the color. Go to my front. I'm changing the color here by clicking on them and dragging them. I could also click on my color swatch here, and this will look different on different people's systems, and choose a color, and it gets copied over. The three settings you should be aware of when you're first starting with surfaces is color, of course, the smoothing option, which attempts to make things smooth. We'll see this on the side. Smoothing off, smoothing on. See these bands here? Hopefully that'll show up. If I turn on smoothing, it's not adding any geometry. It's not changing the geometry in any way. It's just doing some kind of cheat in the render to make it look smooth. This number is sometimes important because sometimes it smooths too much. And we'll see that in our bevel. Smoothing on the bevel is attempting to smooth this angle here, which is between our sides. Turn off smoothing here. Go back to bevel. They're trying to work together, and we get this kind of pillowy effect. So what we want to do is reduce the angle that it tries to smooth. Now it defaults to 89.53, which is just a tiny hair under 90 degrees, which is a right angle. Many times you can fix things by just pulling back on that smoothing angle right there. That's the magic part. At 53 degrees, it's attempting to smooth along with the bevel. We don't want that. We want a nice tight end between the bevel. This seems like a small thing, but believe me, if you understand this, it makes it a lot nicer. See that? Too much smoothing, just the right amount of smoothing. So I said there were three things you need to be aware of. The third thing is specularity. Specularity makes it shiny. Not shiny, very shiny. We can see up here, and going along with that is the glossiness. Glossiness, when something is shiny, it has a specular hot spot. You see, with a high level of glossiness, you have this really tight specular hot spot. Kind of looks like a pool ball. The smaller that gets, it gives a visual cue that this might be something a little bit softer, like maybe plastic, but still shiny. So the three important ones to start with: color, specularity, and smoothing. That's where you can start with texturing. Before we get too deep into texturing, well, let me show you this button here. Sometimes it disappears and you can't find it. This button brings it back. More than a few people have lost it and called me in a panic. Lightwave ships with presets, and that is the button over here. I have my own set of presets that I've developed over the years, but some of these just come along with Lightwave. To use presets, see if we have generic. Okay. To use presets, it is not difficult if you know how. Let's go to our text sides. Here are our presets. I have the side selected. I'm double clicking on my preset. Load settings. Yes. All of a sudden, those settings get loaded. And I can see in this case it is missing something. There we go. Let's try one of the other presets for the bevel. Make it a neon green in the front. Cowhide? No. Let's go with splotches. Now, we're not seeing those splotches. The reason is not everything can get rendered in OpenGL. Some things you do need to do the full render of. So how can you tell when you're doing your settings? Well, final important step with texturing is this little device called Viper. Viper stands for interactive something or other. Open up my surface editor. Viper contains no surface data to render. This is the biggest stumbling block to use Viper. You need to open Viper, then you need to render a scene, or render a frame. You don't even need to render all 5 frames. Just a single pass, and it comes up. What's cool about it, kind of running out of space here, shrink it down, open up my presets. A couple of things are cool about it. I can select a surface by clicking on it in the Viper window. Then when I double click on one of the texture samples, it gets copied over. Click on my front surface, click on this orange peel. And it's giving me instant feedback on my subject. sometimes you get lazy and it's like, well, I spend a lot of time trying to grab that bevel. I could just go back in here, select bevel. And here's an important point. Even though I've copied the same texture to each of these surfaces, they are still three completely different surfaces. They may have the identical surface attributes, but they're still three different objects. And see how this is way too pillowy here? That's because of my smoothing. It's attempting to smooth it even though it doesn't have the geometry to do so. And we get these funky rendering errors here. You know, nobody wants to see that. That's why it's important to understand how smoothing works. Oddly enough, smoothing does not always show up correctly in the Viper window. It shows up better in our OpenGL. So we'll render this. Now there's a lot of stuff going on this surface. Even though it's just an orange peel surface, we've got bumps going on, we've got shininess going on, we've got the orange color. And we'll get to all that when we talk about surfacing. But that is basically how you load textures, you surface textures, how you render out the scene. Let's take this from scratch. We're going to load the scene before we start texturing it. So we have our original funky looking surface here. So I'm going to open my surface editor. I have my surfaces here. I'm going to open my Viper. Now, it won't show me anything because I've loaded the scene, but I haven't rendered a single frame. That is mistake number one that most beginners have. They open Viper, they can't see anything. That is because you need to render at least one pass of a frame for it to show up. Now in Lightwave 8, we have two modes, draft and mosaic. Mostly when I use normal. In Lightwave 7.5, you have slightly different settings, but it comes out the same. So I'm going to open presets, go to metals, because metals are cool. And let's choose brass for the sides. Oh, you know what? I lost my lights. I didn't save this after I added the lights. So I've selected the sides, and I'm going to select brass. And it is copied over the brass to the side reflection. And I'm going to select my front and double click on gold. Now, metal reflections are interesting in that they don't really read as metal unless they're moving. But I can also see that smoothing got turned on, and I bet you it's going to look funky in my layout. Well, actually, it doesn't look too bad. Open up surfaces again and presets. And just to keep things interesting, let's grab our bevel and select the hammered chrome. And now these are all presets that you should have when you loaded up Lightwave. Sometimes in some installations of Lightwave, it has trouble finding the presets. If these presets are not showing up, I suggest you call tech support at NewTek because they should be there. So I've just copied over a couple of these, funky looking metal textures. A bunch of nice ones in there. We see how that's all pillowy there? Yep. Looks like we have to adjust. Let's see, that was for the front. We'll just turn smoothing off for that. And we found out that Bevel likes it around 19 or so. Size like, I think that was around 50. It'll just save us a headache later on. And there we go. Our lights. Well, we only have one light. Let's add another light in there. Distant light. Call it side. Go through this again. Rotate. Keyframe it at 0. Okay, everybody's happy. And set our camera properties to enhanced low. And I believe we adjusted our lights a little bit so they weren't 100% white. My main light, I made it a little bit yellowish. Kind of golden side light. To complement it, do exactly the opposite. Give it a little bit blue. And once again, a little bit more than I normally would. Tone down the side light a little bit. Let's render a frame and see how that looks. This frame took 5.2 seconds. Remember, the first time we rendered this, it was 0.5 seconds. So it was literally 10 times longer with the anti-aliasing and also with the more interesting textures, because there's a lot more math going on. On the other hand, it's 5 seconds. So I've got a 90 frame animation at 5 seconds. So 90 times 5 seconds takes what, 4.5 minutes to render the whole thing? Not too bad of an investment. So look at this. It took, if you follow along with the previous tutorial where we created this object, we typed it in, we extruded it, we beveled it, we gave it 3 different surfaces. After that, we brought it into layout, keyframed it just flying in from the side. Once we had our motion set up, I copied over some textures. I believe you could go from start to finish in probably less than 5 minutes, and you could get here. And then another 5 minutes to render, 10 minutes. Not too bad, and this is cool. In fact, let's take another step here. It ends at 90. Let's go to 120. Select our camera. Alright. Everything's right there. And we want, say, keyframe our camera at 90 and delete the first one. And then I'm just going to move the camera in. I can create a keyframe where it flies through this 0. Actually, let's make it go through, that's fine. So it's kind of the center here. At that point, it would probably do some kind of transition in post, where I maybe do a flare or some kind of quick fade or wipe that looks like I'm transitioning from this logo into something a little more cool. Let's render this, see what this looks like up close and personal. And we're seeing the metallic sheen on here, some of the crumple on the sides, and I was just kind of grabbing these textures at random. I might decide something else. Maybe the crumple is a little bit too much. Maybe one of the other textures would work better. You can see these steps of our motion blur. Now it's kind of standing out now because it's still, but when it's moving, and actually if you examine real video, sometimes you actually get that stair stepping. But if it bothers you a lot, you go in and you increase the number of passes. We'll go to medium here so we're not here all day. So I've set the pass to medium anti-aliasing, so it took 9 passes. Look at that, 51.7 seconds. So that is literally 100 times more than our first pass. However, we are a lot closer. We're doing a lot more anti-aliasing. We've got textures going on. Instead of this stair stepping, we now have this, which is much smoother, much more likable. But at 51 seconds, at 120 frames, you've got like an hour and a half of rendering, as opposed to the 5 seconds it took just to get per frame here. And I'm guessing that this frame would render much faster. Go back to our enhanced low. If you render this, boom, 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 we're there in just about 2 seconds. So rendering time is an issue, especially in the industry. You got to do a little bit of math. What some people do is render every 10 or every 30 frames, get an idea of how long this thing will take to render. My rule of thumb is, how long will this take to render? Can I sit here and watch it? If it's like 5 minutes or less, is it something I need to do over my lunch break, or is it something I need to do overnight? And it's something you kind of become accustomed to the more you use this, but this is the basics. This is how you start out. This is a professional quality. This would be something that could be broadcast. We have nice colors going on here. We've got a nice clean logo. It's a nice clean graphic, set and ready to go. I can do it in under 5 minutes. So that, if you can get this far, that's a really good start. Then you can start exploring some of the other options.